Soft Science of Business Transformation with Mr. Gopalakrishnan, author, corporate advisor, the Mindworks and past president, All India Management Association. We have a chief guest, Professor Deepak Nayyar, Emeritus Professor of Economics, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and former Vice Chancellor, Delhi University. The session shall be based on the book authored by Mr. Gopalakrishnan on the subject published by Bloomsbury. May we please request you all to take your seats, keep your mobile phones on silent while the session is on. We'll start the program shortly. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our dignitaries, Professor Nayyar and Mr. R. Gopalakrishnan. With a big round of applause, please.
Long time no see. A long time.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
How are you doing?
Okay. A very good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We've all gathered here for the interactive session and book launch on Embrace the Future, the Soft Science of Business Transformation. It is my privilege and honor to introduce the dignitaries on the dais. Mr. R. Gopalakrishnan is an author, corporate advisor, the Mindworks and past president of All India Management Association. He studied physics at Kolkata University, engineering at IIT Kharagpur, and attended advanced management program at Harvard Business School. Mr. Gopalakrishnan has been involved in multiple organizational transformations during his professional career of over 50 years in Unilever and Tata. This is Mr. Gopalakrishnan's 19th book. Seated next to Mr. Gopalakrishnan is Professor Deepak Nayyar, our chief guest for this session. Professor Nayyar is Emeritus Professor of Economics at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and an honorary fellow of Balliol College, Oxford. He was recently invited to the Cludge Chair in Countries and Cultures of the South at the United States Library of Congress, Washington, D.C., for the academic year 22-23. He was Distinguished University Professor of Economics at the New School of Social Research, New York. He has also served as Vice Chancellor, University of Delhi. Earlier, he taught at the University of Oxford, the University of Sussex, and the Indian Institute of Management, Calcutta. Professor Nayyar is Chairman of the Board of the Institute of Development Studies, Sussex, in Britain, and was Chairman of the Board of the World Institute for Development Economics Research, UNU WIDER, Helsinki. He has served as a director on the board of Social Science Research Council in the United States. He's also served as a member of the World Commission on the Social Dimension of Globalization, as Vice Chairman of South Center, Geneva, and Vice President of International Association of Universities. His professional life in academia has been interspersed with time in world of public policy as Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India and Secretary in the Ministry of Finance. He was educated at St. Stephen's College and Delhi School of Economics in Delhi University. Thereafter, as a Rhodes Scholar, he went on to study at Balliol College, University of Oxford, where he obtained a Bachelor of Philosophy and a PhD in economics. Professor Nayyar has published numerous articles in professional journals and several books. His books include the best-selling Catch Up and The Intelligent Person's Guide to Liberalization, both of which have been translated into many languages. His latest books, Resurgent Asia, also a bestseller, and Asian Transformations, published by Oxford University Press, analyze the remarkable economic transformation and rise of Asia in the past century. I now request Professor Nayyar, our chief guest, to address the gathering and set the context for today's session. Sir.
Thank you for the warm words of welcome. I consider it an honor and a privilege to be here at the launch of this book by Mr. Gopalakrishnan. This is the first time in my life, and I have been at many such events, that I am actually speaking at a launch of a book which is about business and business transformations. Let me begin with the authors who emphasize that companies which fail to adapt as time and circumstances change are destined to perish. Thus, success or failure in business transformations, and this is their central argument, depends on the art and the science of change, akin to the heart and the mind, striking a balance between the two in the process. This idea, I think, conforms to the more general hypothesis that was put forward by John Kenneth Galbraith a long time ago. Capitalism survives because it adapts to change, which other systems of organized economies do not. So whether it is economic crises, political turbulence, social change, capitalism has shown the capacity to adapt, and that's why it continues. In some sense, it's also much like evolutionary biology on why species survive. Now, the importance of this idea eludes conventional thinking, almost certainly in economics, theories of the firm or of industrial organization, as well as business schools, models about decision-making or strategies. It is only a historical perspective, whether it is economic history or business history, that is conducive to understanding, for it recognizes that there is the past in our present and the future in our past. In other words, the past permeates the present and influences the future. Now, our hosts have requested me to situate this work in its wider context, and that's what I will do. That is where my comparative advantage lies, is sketching the big picture with bold strokes on a white canvas. It's not about joining the little dots. Now, reflected in this process that Gopal and his co-author describe and analyze is reflected in the evolution of the firm over the past 2 centuries. It began life in the exploitative sweatshops born in the Industrial Revolution in Britain, then in France, and the rest of Europe. In the early 19th century, the pioneering firms of the late 19th century, which Alfred Marshall, a distinguished economist in Cambridge, characterized as firms that were run by entrepreneurs who saw everything, did everything, and controlled everything. It was one single apex, which it moved to the multi-product, multi-division, national firm by the mid-20th century. And it was not long before it moved to the large international corporation, large international firm. By the early 1970s, it also moved from commodities to manufacturing, just as it moved from what we saw as international trade to intra-firm trade, as production processes upstream and downstream were integrated. And they were, these large international firms were the vanguard or the cutting edge of this era of globalization. what followed was a fragmentation and an internationalization of production processes, which began with international subcontracted and ended up with global value chains, and ultimately to just-in-time production systems pioneered by the Japanese, where inventory management was exceedingly skilled. But by and large, until the early 1970s, this was a phase of competitive capitalism, or what people like Baran and Sweezy on the left described as monopoly capitalism. But it was not long before it moved to becoming a managerial capitalism, where it was no longer the owners that managed the large international firms, it was the managers that managed large international firms. And it did not matter whether we were in a bank-centered financial system, such as in Germany or Japan, or a stock market-centered financial system, as in the United States, or Britain, or India. Now, in some ways, the evolution of this is best described by a nice analogy that was drawn by Stephen Heimer, who used to teach economics at Harvard, died at a young age, in comparing the giant firms of the 19th century in the colonial era, whether it was the East India Company or the Dutch East India Company, with the modern international corporation. And he said those companies of the colonial era were like dinosaurs. They were large in bulk, but small in brain. The modern national and international corporation was the opposite. It was small in bulk, but large in brain, much before we got the big internationalization of firms. Now, in a sense, this is the big picture in terms of economic history and business history, how firms have evolved over time. But firms have evolved as times and circumstances have changed, okay? So that you've had technological change, you've had closures, you had brand names like Kodak disappear because they failed to adapt to change consciously. But we have moved way beyond that world, where forms of business organization are no longer dominant, but they coexist. So you have the large international firms in pharmaceuticals, you have the large international firms in automobiles, but at the same time, you have a return of entrepreneurial capitalism of the kind that we saw in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And in a sense, this is what startups are about. This is what unicorns are about. It's the one person who starts it. Now, some become behemoths. Microsoft did, Google did, Apple did, Amazon. They started as entrepreneurial capitalism, but they adapted not just to changes in time and circumstances. They conceptualized new forms of business, new forms of business leadership. Now, what we have today is a kaleidoscope in a sense, and I'd quite like to know what Gopal thinks of that. There are different forms of industrial organization within firms. You know, Ronald Coase got the Nobel Prize in economics for only 2 papers he ever wrote. One was about when do firms internalize services and when do they externalize services? When do they have a legal department and an accounts department inside, and when they subcontract? Now, what has happened today is that you have different forms of business organization that coexist. There is no single dominant form, and these people are capable of making a transition. These firms make a transition from one category to the other. This has been true, say, in information technology, which started on a small scale. It's been just as true in biotechnology, which started on a small scale. So that you have Tata Consultancy Services or you have Infosys. They are also behemoths, as it were. Now, what I'm suggesting is that these are evolutionary processes. And the central idea of the book is a very important idea, that business transformations succeed only if and only if they are able to adapt to change. And this change is part in the heart and part in the mind. I want to conclude simply by referring, because Gopal suggested this to me. You know, I was in the Ministry of Finance from 89 to 91. Well, you know, for someone who has done macroeconomics for a lifetime, it was the equivalent of 3 lifetimes in macroeconomics. Those 2.5 years, 3 governments, difficult times. But at the end of it, in 91, we brought about a major transformation in economic policies. Now, it was bound to shape what happened in India. The period from 1950 to 1990 was a period of learning to industrialize. It was actually in conformity with the industrial policy of the times. That was based on import substitution, on protection in trade policies. It was the then conventional wisdom. The mistake we made in India was that transition was 20 years too late in coming. We should have made that transition in the early 70s and not in the early 90s. Because there were limits to capacity expansion and capacity creation, firms did not need to evolve. There were barriers to entry. Competition was exceedingly limited. And there were rents apart from monopoly profits. What is worse, you got a stagnation and fossilization of technology rather than absorption and innovation. Now, this changed in the period from the early 90s to the 2020s. We have witnessed what this book describes, a restructuring of firms in the manufacturing sector. Firms that did not adapt perished, and that happened in the capital goods sector. Because you had access to imports of capital goods, intermediate inputs, technologies, investment, and you also got an internationalization of firms from India for a diversity of reasons. Some were seeking access to raw materials, but that was much more Chinese firms than Indian firms. They were in commodities. But Indian firms were seeking access to markets and access to technologies as a means of mergers and acquisitions, or their means of doing so. Now, some of these firms have become global. Others have not, for reasons that you analyze so nicely in your book. But at the end of the day, if we look back, it is now more than 30 years since 1991. What do we see? The share of manufacturing in output and in employment is 4 to 5 percentage points lower than it was in 1990. China's share and India's share of world manufacturing value added was exactly the same in 1990. Today, our share in world manufacturing value added is 3.5%, and that of China is 27%. Yeah? We have, in other words, we are not simply lagging behind China, but we are lagging behind countries such as Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, and indeed Vietnam. Even Bangladesh has left us behind in the clothing and textile sector. So something is not quite right. I will leave you with this paradox, Gopal, to pick up. Why is it that, in 1990, R&D expenditure as a proportion of national income in India was larger than in China? It was 0.67 and China was 0.6. In 2020, China's R&D expenditure as a proportion of GDP was 2.7%. Ours had come down to 0.6%. So something is not quite right in the evolution of business organizations in India. And I pose to you the symptoms of the malaise, but perhaps you have answers in terms of your hypothesis. Let me stop.
Thank you, Professor Nayyar, for setting the context for us. May I now request to please release the book here before we invite Mr. Gopalakrishnan for his words. Thank you.
Thank you and congratulations.
May I now invite Mr. Gopalakrishnan to have a few words with us?
Thank you very much for that, and I'm particularly delighted that the very first launch of this book, which just came out a few weeks ago, is at AIMA in Delhi. And AIMA has hosted very kindly and generously the launch of all my 19 books. And this time also, it is a pleasure for me to be here. Having been the past president of AIMA, I think they feel a bit obliged to do this, but I think they do a damn good job of it. And I want to thank my dear friend Deepak for agreeing to be the chief guest. He must be having lots of such demands coming on him. But he's been very kind to say, for you as a friend, I'll be happy. You know, he's just come back after 10 days. He got off a flight from Heathrow. He's hardly had 36 hours. And I know he's traveling for the next 10 days. So I'm really deeply appreciative of your generosity. I'm also very grateful that AIMA has brought me my very old friends together, whom I wouldn't normally get to see. My friend Asad Pathan is here, Vinod Sopti, Chand Tulsian, Anand Bhushan, and my dear friend Gurdeep and Meera are here, because all of them have shared their early years and several facets of our lives together. So it's really very nice. And and Raj Kaprihan, and I also find I have Mr. Kalra here, and Asad Pathan, all good friends. My PTI directors are here, not only Deepak himself, but Mr. Murali, who's the chief of the Hindu, and Praveen Someshwar, who's in Hindustan Times. So there's a gathering here, which there's a jalsa feeling, you know, and I'm very grateful. And my publishers, Bloomsbury, are also here. I saw Meenakshi, didn't she come? Yeah, Meenakshi. Is that Aarti there? Yeah. We must mention them because I can tell you writing a book looks very complicated, but publishing it and marketing it is even more complicated. So it's nice that you could come. I will not attempt to answer the questions that Deepak has raised. I have an opinion, but that's not part of my book. And what I thought I would do in the next 15 minutes, and then we can have a discussion perhaps, is to share what is in the book. I have been very privileged to spend my entire career of 50 years in two companies which have lasted out 100 and many years. Hindustan Lever is 150, Unilever is 150 years old, and so is Tata. And my claim to wanting to write this book, my co-author, by the way, who lives in Chicago, is not here, but he too has spent his whole career of 35 years in Unilever, is what makes a company live long. I mean, there are companies and companies, and we are constantly assailed with the statistic that the Fortune 500 list of companies is changing the sequence. And that gave us the trigger to start thinking, it must be true that long-lasting companies are adaptive. This is deductive rather than inductive logic. And then we sat down together, like two people who worked together for many years. We had our arguments, but they were healthy arguments. And we decided to write this book because he was coming from the position that companies must have strategy, which means intellectual rigor, analytical rigor, techniques, models to predict the future and adapt to it. I was coming from the position that companies must behave like creatures in nature. You're adapting all the time. Otherwise, you'll be caught when at a time you didn't expect to be caught. And we, at some stage of our argument, decided that instead of arguing, is it possible that I have a left glove and you have a right glove? And we put it together. And when we recounted our experience, which appears in the early part of the book, we made a distinction between two types of transformation. What is called transactional and what is called strategic. Transactional transformation is happening all the time. You change on a daily basis. You change from supplier 1 to supplier 2. You relay your production lines. You relaunch your products. But strategic transformation is something that has a very long effect. It may happen after 10, 20, 30 years. And it involves a lot of people. So you can do industrial engineering and work study and do transformation of a production line. I'm not saying it's easy, don't get me wrong. I'm merely making the distinction. And the second thing that we found was when we joined the company, Gurdeep will remember this because he also joined about the same time. Mr. Tandon was the chairman, and he had set in motion something called sales reorganization. Basically, it was taking 3 sales forces and combining them to make them 2. But it shook the company. And we were young trainees and we were all drafted in to help with all the donkey work that was there. And that's how you learn. So we are grateful for it. But latterly, as I've described in the book, it seems to be every 3-4 years something is happening. And of course, we all know that the pace of technology and social change is rapidly increasing. So it's not surprising. But we tend to forget this. We tend to forget that somehow tomorrow is not going to be like yesterday. Because we want the comfort of yesterday to just continue. Today morning in the Financial Times London, and I would commend you to read, Martin Wolf, who is well known in India as a good economic writer and must be a friend of yours, Deepak, has written a lead article which is worth reading. He says, Britain's elusive search for transformation. So it's a disease, if I may use that word. Disease is a bad word. It's a problem, an enigma that is affecting business organizations, micro as you call it, macro, Britain, India, 1991. And you think of our own country, at least in the front part I can see some grey hair, so they will remember this. How Hindi was attempted to be brought in as a national language and the tensions it created. How family planning was introduced right in the 60s through DAVP. And a little aside on the family planning, when we were trainees, Hindustan Lever had been requested by government to popularize and distribute Nirod. And so we were young, innocent people at that time. We still think we are, but not that innocent. And to explain how Nirod works and so on was embarrassing for us. And the campaign that the DAVP ran at that time was to show a young couple getting married. And it was all newspaper ads in those days. And the line said, Mubarak ho, some words to the effect, Mubarak ho, lekin pehla bachcha 5 saal ke liye nahi leva. So they were appealing to the mind. But it flopped. Nothing happened to the population increase growth rate. People merrily kept having babies. And when they analyzed what is it that went wrong, they found that no Indian girl can be told for 5 years not to show results. Her mother-in-law, sister-in-law, everybody will get after her. So they changed the campaign into another press campaign, which showed a handsome young man and a beautiful young girl with a baby in their arms. And they said, Pehla bachcha hua Mubarak, dusre bachche ke liye 5 saal chodo. Now I'm dramatizing it. I'm not suggesting it's only one item that changed it. But today India's population growth rate, it's taken 50 years. We have come quite close, not quite yet there, to replacement rate. But I'm mentioning the story of family planning, and there are other stories in the book, because it showed that you have to have major transformation, you have to appeal to heart and mind. Our training as engineers, as economists, as administrators is to talk to the mind. समझा दो उनको, समझ जाएंगे. तुमने समझदारी से नहीं बताया उनको. But you have to talk to this also. And we are not very good at that. Men folk particularly, women are, I think, better at it. But that's a... So, what we have developed in the early part of the book is that there are two gloves. An intellectual glove and an intuitive glove. The intellectual glove is about rational, analytical methods to analyze the past and take a look at the future. And that's what most planners do in companies, in governments, in planning commissions. And it's important, don't get me wrong. And in management literature, those of us who have been managers know that many theories, Michael Porter, Richard Rumelt, Clayton Christensen, these names are all known to any person who's been in management. Each one has given his own model. But the intuitive part, the right glove, has been covered by behavioral people. Jim Collins, John Cotter, Tony Porras. But these are two different worlds. Behavioral people don't care for the intellectual people. The intellectual people don't have much time for the behavioral people. And what Rishi and I thought we would do is, can't we sell two gloves together? Because that's what a line manager has to do. All of us know you have to do it. There is nothing original that we have to state. Because there are very few things in life and in management which are so original that you never thought of it. Somebody may throw a little angle on it and you get it. And so this is probably the first book, if not the only book that I have come across, where these two are put together. And like the braids of a dancer, Bharatanatyam dancer, if the flowers are not interwoven with the hair in a certain sequence and geometry, it will not stay when she's dancing. So you have to braid it together. We've tried to do that. If I have to share one overarching lesson, there are a number of examples in the book. In the interest of providing time for an interaction, I shan't run through them. But while this book does draw on theoretical principles and academic research, its essential platform is one of practitioners' reality. I was talking with Deepak and narrating to him what Mr. L.K. Jha, I think. No, it is B.K. Nehru, who went to London School of Economics in 1937. And then he was walking with Harold Lasky after 20 years of serving in the districts. And Lasky asked him, "So young Nehru, did all the things that we teach you at London School of Economics come to be of any value to you?" And his reply, B.K. Nehru, was, "Yes, sir, because none of them is relevant or applicable in India." So in a sense, you have to use academic research in a pragmatic way. And we think we have put that together so the matar and the paneer are sort of in balance. I thought I would just close by talking of two or three things that leaped out at us. And I have little doubt that anybody who's managed anything, including, by the way, a building society or Delhi Gymkhana, would have experienced all this. There's nothing original. Long survivors, whether they're human beings or organizations, of course they must have EQ, of course they must have IQ, but they must also have AQ. And AQ stands for adaptability quotient. But nobody is teaching you, A, that you need it, B, how to develop it. And any of us can give a talk for half an hour, 45 minutes on how you must be adaptive. But ask a caterpillar, how did it adapt to become a butterfly? He says, I don't know, it happened. Ask a woman, how did she get that baby out of the womb? She said, but bahut dard hua when baby came out. The reality is, and in biology it's called the emergence principles. 6 or 7 things have to happen at the same time. The blood pressure must drop, the muscle must contract, the hormones must change, the head must be down. And then, yes, it happens, but that's called the emergence principle. Major transformation requires the emergence principle. It's like an orchestra. There's no point having the trumpeter on one note and somebody on the other note. And this is what we call AQ. And how do you develop AQ? By consciously undertaking the pain of embracing the future. Because it's painful. Embracing the past is easy. I got married in this year, my children came, my children got married. If you come to my house, Pinky ki shadi ki video dekhni hai, you can show them. These are all easy to embrace, the past. How do you embrace oxygen? How do you embrace helium? Because that's not got a form or a shape which is possible to embrace. And that's why it's painful and we run away from it. And somehow hope. I began my career 50 years ago as a computer analyst. And I'm not talking of laptops and stuff like that, I'm talking of mainframe computers. The only person who said, I don't need to understand what you're doing and very proud of your job was my grandmother. Because she said, even the chairman is not sitting in an air-conditioned room, but you're working in an air-conditioned room. That was her source of pride. Therefore, I must find a girl for you to marry, etc. The resistance to computers, that they will completely transform, all the jobs will be gone, those of my age group will all recognize because they have lived through it. But it was inevitable. And today, if you tell when my grandchildren see me reading the newspaper with a cup of coffee, they laugh. They say, Daddy, you're looking cute. You're looking quaint. They've learned these words in school because it's an oddball for them. And the same thing is happening with technology. AI, ESG, these are all big buzzwords. They have important impacts. Nobody is sure how to deal with it, but everybody knows he must deal with it. Hence the AQ part. And I love to quote and the book, we have mentioned that, when a caterpillar becomes a butterfly, here is what happens. In the Nilgiris, which I visit quite frequently, there is a butterfly farm. So I went there to understand कि भाई ये तो major transformation is होता क्या है? I can't say I saw all this live under my nose, but I did some reading. When the larva has become it can't move. The animal, caterpillar, has something called the imaginal discs. Imaginal disc means the DNA. मैं असली में क्या हूँ, कौन हूँ? Barring that, everything else dissolves in a soup. The whole caterpillar dissolves. It becomes a soup. The only thing that's remained of the original is the imaginal disc. Using those imaginal discs, the caterpillar recreates itself. Develops wings, its eyes fall off. And then one morning, it flies off as a colorful butterfly. If I look at Tata or Liva or any organization which has lasted 100, 150 years, they have learned this art intuitively. How to dissolve the past in a soup, but retain the imaginal discs, which are the culture of the company. हमारे यहाँ ऐसा ही रिवाज है, हम ऐसे ही करते हैं. This will not negotiable. I'm talking of values that don't change. I'm not talking of practices. And then, I reflect. Jamshedji Tata started Tatas in 1868. In those days, the bigger it was, the better. You got scale, steel plants, hydroelectric power. And from there, today, the chairman of Tata is looking for the smallest. जितना छोटा हो उतना अच्छा है, nano scale में करो. 2 mm, 5 mm, nm, 10 nm microchips. Now, within one corporation, to have changed over 100 years and done whatever Tatas have done, which is known in the past, it's almost metaphorically like saying it's a combination of Andrew Carnegie plus Henry Ford plus John Hilton plus Robert Noyce. All of them rolled together into one person and his successors. We have also pointed out in the book some of the softer aspects of the risks. And I'm not going to go through all of them. We have only 15 minutes left to finish this session. But I want to point out that as we grow older, and the front row friends of mine will recognize what I'm saying, you know, your nerve ends get touchy. One of the reasons for that is the process of demyelination. I was unaware of this. Our nerve ends have something called myelin. Myelin is like a cap at the end of the nerve which protects it, like an insulation on a wire. As you get older, this starts to thin out. Then your nerve gets exposed. Then your body gets touchy about things that you were not touchy about, 15 years ago. This is called demyelination. And organizations also have myelin at the end of their little nerve ends, because the organizations have nerve ends. And when that gets worn out with age, management has to do something to think about it and remyelinate. That's what I mean by the imaginal discs and so on and so forth. So I'm going to stop there. I want to conclude. I've given you a sense of what's in the book. I've told you why my co-author and I felt this is a very important subject. Because whereas a potential leader back in the 60s and 70s could say, I must learn information technology, I must learn programming, I must learn coding, I must learn better manufacturing. Today's managers' essential skill is transformation. And the results of not developing those skills is there for us to see all around. So, thank you, Deepak, once again. Thank you, AIMA, once again. And thank you for your patience in listening to me.
Thank you, sir, for giving us an insight into the book. Sure looks very interesting one. And ladies and gentlemen, this book will be available on sale just outside the auditorium, and you can get it signed by the author himself. At AIMA, we keep these sessions interactive, and we'd like to take a few questions. Please raise your hands and the mic will reach. Can anyone bring in the mic here to the second row?
Gopal, I'll give you the first question. But first, congratulations on the book, Deepak. Lovely intro to the macro view. India, you talk about corporations, and Deepak spoke about countries, and he compared India and China. If you now see what are the top 10 things India imports into India, what we have realized suddenly is that SaaS services has become very big in it. It is the 11th or the 12th thing which gets imported. It's $20 billion now plus. So there's oil at $120 billion, there's gold, there's minerals, and there is SaaS services. We talk about Make in India, we talk about SaaS, and can you believe that all the startups we have can't really deliver on SaaS requirements? Deepak spoke about China, and China has managed that end very, very well by transforming and making sure local SaaS products are available. What do you think we should do, man? Heart and mind put together as a country to unlock this opportunity?
Thanks for that, Praveen. You know, I don't want to pass off as an expert in SaaS. I'm not. But this much I can say. If you're exporting $200 billion of software, there's no harm in importing $20 billion of SaaS. What's your problem? But that's just sort of mind, doing the maths. There are successful SaaS companies. Take Zoho. It's a listed company and it's profitable. It's not like many of the other startups which have... perhaps there's an evolution in this. Perhaps this reality that you have pointed out, I myself was unaware. But sometimes some items increase in imports, but you can do very little about it. I'll give you an example of a field which I am recognized. India used to be the net exporter of edible oils 100 years ago. Today we are the world's largest importers. And we've been talking about self-sufficiency in edible oils for the last, at least since I started my career. So let me not provide an answer because I don't have an answer, but let me say that import of SaaS per se doesn't worry me. If I had no software exports, and it's not insubstantial, it's 200 billion, then I would worry. So.
Slightly different take on your question. If you're a latecomer to industrialization or to technology, there is no way that you can do it with free trade. The advocates of free trade are always those who have led the process. But by the way, not even Britain industrialized without protection. In the period 1870 to 1914, the United States had the highest tariffs in the world. The countries that were free trade were India, Indonesia, and China. They deindustrialized. Now the champions of free trade are Chinese. That changes. Who advocates free trade, when and why. But ultimately, industrialization and development are about transforming your production capabilities in the economy, because that's what extends consumption possibility frontiers do from the demand side. Now the Chinese have thought it through. Yeah? Why is it, if you're always importing technologies and have the option of doing so, you're like the schoolboy who never learns because somebody else can write the exam for you. Yeah? So you need a strategic technology policy. Why is it that BYD is suddenly the biggest exporter of e-cars? They were not, 10 years ago they were unheard of, because there is a conscious strategic thinking about what we should do. We had a fantastic comparative advantage in pharmaceuticals. And what did we do? Because we are good at it, we let all the manufactured intermediates be made in China. Our firms were part of that process. No one ever did the strategic thinking. So I think, industrial policy at a macro level is just as important as at the firm level. That's what transforms firms. It's not as if the heart and the mind in the firm is important, but the heart and the mind even in those who make policies is important. Do they have a long-term view? Yeah? All late industrializers had a long-term view. Germany and the United States, who followed in the footsteps of Britain, Japan, who was the first the last of the early industrializers, or South Korea, Taiwan, now China. Everybody's had, but we don't have that view. The questions I ended with, why is R&D so low in India? Why is it that we are doing so much worse than others? Because we always want to be followers. We don't want to be leaders. By the way, if you follow technologies, you'll never catch up. Yeah? Because the pace of technological progress is so high. Therefore, what you need to do is leapfrog. That's what the South Koreans did. They did a technological leapfrog. When somebody else, they were making cars following the Japanese, but cars are pretty standardized, but they were thinking ahead. They were thinking ahead of chips manufacture, they were thinking of 5G, and that's why they arrived. Now, I think we in India also need, just as we need that mix of heart and mind at the firm, but firm needs an enabling environment that comes from policy. And that's where we have failed. I mean, why have we have deindustrialized in the past 30 years, where everybody else in Asia has left us behind.
Thank you, Deepak and Gopal. Wonderful session, which was expected, of course. So I'm also a product of Delhi University, having spent about a decade in 4 of the different faculties during Professor Monish Raza and Professor Sarup Singh's time. So it's wonderful to meet up. You came in a little later. Well, Gopal, of course, the nuggets that you gave, they're always wonderful. I have a request actually rather than a question. I go back to your first book, When the Penny Drops, and in the launch session, you had narrated a wonderful story which has, kept me hooked on, where you as a division head noticed there was some embezzlement that had happened. You, with your honesty, went to, at that time you were a lower level leader, if I may use the term, junior level leader, and you went up to the senior level leader, and that transformed, the HUL did not lose an asset like you, and the visionary leadership of Dr. Ashok Ganguly. I think most of the people here may not have attended that. That was a wonderful story on leadership and followership. That's fantastic. I would request you to share that. Thank you.
Yeah, let's take.
Sure.
Mr. Deepak, how you see capitalism in 21st century and way ahead? As you talked about competitive capitalism, managerial capitalism, then social capitalism and human capitalism. And Mr. Krishnan, what would be the hard science of to embrace the future business? As you talked in 1868, Tata think about hydropower, steel, and nano chip and silicon. Kindly respond. Thank you.
Well, I'm an economist, but I'm not an astrologer. I don't know where capitalism will be 100 years from now. But let me simply say, and this is the heart of the book, that at the end of the day, whether it is firms or individuals or governments, they will succeed in difficult times, in changing times, if and only if they have the capacity to adapt. Now, I would argue that capitalism, there are good capitalisms, bad capitalisms, ugly capitalisms, right? But capitalisms have a capacity to adapt. In this, I'm not very sure. This is John Kenneth Galbraith's argument. No other system of organizing production and consumption in society has worked as well as capitalism. It doesn't mean that capitalism is perfect. It has flaws, it has warts. And in my view, if you think of society at large, markets are very good servants, but they're very bad masters, because they tend also to fail sometimes. Now, in a sense, it is a bit like democracy. Democracy today is at a discount. Young people are disillusioned with democracy. They bring in populist authoritarian leaders everywhere. And all evidence we have available suggests that those over 50 are supportive of the idea of a democracy. Those who are less than 30 are in general not supportive of the idea of democracy. But does that mean I reject democracy? Because for me, democracy is a prior. It is the only thing that has self-correcting mechanisms, even if it works slowly. 250 years after democracy was introduced in the United States, it is at risk with Mr. Trump. We are only 75 years old as a democracy. So democracies are at risk, but that does not mean I reject the idea of a democracy. It is about the only system which provides some semblance of rights and freedoms to citizens. It's the only system that corrects itself. Do you see Mr. Putin ever correcting? Thank you.
Sir, I won't go through the whole story, but only in deference to your request. You have some of the facts wrong. I was not a very junior officer, I was a board member.
Okay. Fair enough. Apologies, sir.
I was full of pride and arrogance. I don't mind admitting now, it's 35 years ago, that at 41, 42 I was a director. And then I found the fraud. What are you, hold both? And this, without going into the whole story, all that happened was, I said, what do I do when I find a fraud? There were three options, as far as I could remember. One was to hope that it will go away, keep quiet, commonly seen. Second was to tell my CFO, get me more facts. Dekha jayega. Third was to go and say, I'm in trouble. I need help. I had a very nice, humane boss called Bipin Shah. God bless his soul, he's now late Bipin Shah, who told me go for the third route. If you show your vulnerability, then the company can help you. If you suppress it, the company can't even help you. So as far as Hindustan Lever was concerned, I went to my boss. I said, I'm in trouble. And the company really helped me. At the end of 2 more years, they even promoted me, but that's luck of the draw. I'm narrating the story not because all of you should emulate it, but that's my experience. And sir, your question was, what is the hard science? The hard science is what is taught everywhere. And you'll find half of this book is about the hard science. The rational models, which tell you step 1, step 2, step 3, go from here to there, etc. What is distinctive about this book is it says, while you're doing that, which is very important, by the way, I'm not suggesting that you ignore it. You must consider the human dimension. And what the human dimension does, there are 2 circuits in our brain. One is the analytical circuit and one is the intuitive circuit. We tend to switch off the intuitive circuit, except when you have to get along with your spouse. Then you switch it on, because otherwise you won't have a spouse after some time. But what it's saying is put on your intuitive thing, because there's a trade-off which your analytical circuit doesn't encourage. If I do it this way, it will take longer. It will cost more. Why don't I do it this way? It will be shorter and direct. I mean, I'm taking Hindi as an example. Just getting up and saying everybody must speak Hindi from day after tomorrow, it's efficient. But releasing Raj Kapoor and Devanand to sing songs for pretty girls around trees makes people in Kumbakonam say, Kaun banega crore, sir? Adi Tamil irna enna, sir? I can understand. 1 crore is 1 crore, whether it's in Hindi or Tamil. The role that Hindi film industry has played in the popularization of Hindi, you have to come to the south to see and believe. The role that Kaun Banega Crorepati and Amitabh Bachchan have played, people don't realize it in the north because you take it for granted. In Kumbakonam, you can't even pronounce that name. People are watching Kaun Banega Crorepati. They don't understand what's going on, but they look at the facial expression and they look at the words. So one requires time, patience and trial. One requires efficiency. One requires effectiveness. Marrying efficiency and effectiveness is the key. I hope I've answered your question.
Sir, just one small question. Let this be the last question, please.
So if I'm audible, then may I speak? Good evening, sir. This question comes from the lesser informed part of the crowd. We are management students from Sushant University in Gurgaon. And hence, our question is less strategic. You gave a good analogy of intellectual versus intuitive. And as we understand it, is left and right brain, or whatever parts of the brain, as we understand it. And finally, leading to the adaptive quotient. For us, students who are just learning about business and business studies, is there a way we can train for adaptive quotient?
That's why I'm writing the book here. इतनी मेहनत के बाद आप पूछ रहे हैं रामायण में कहाँ पे आया, सीता कहाँ से आ गया? Please read my book. And you people are academics, I presume you're teaching these students. Develop a pedagogy. I have done my little bit. I teach a program which I've now stopped doing because time has moved on, called LWNT, which stands for Learning What Nobody Teaches. It's a 13 lecture series on exactly this side, not on the other side. But I did it for about 8 or 10 years, and it takes away a lot of my energy. I have now stopped doing it. But I'm very happy to share the material. If your faculty wants to use it, use it.
Okay. Just a postscript. and this relates much more to business school than it does to universities. You know, there was a time Gopal and I were having this conversation. There was a time when every business school, a course on ethics and values was mandatory. It's gone. Doesn't exist anywhere. And yet, capitalism is also about morality. It's your story about the fraud. And that is somehow being lost in the world of management education. I worry about that. So maybe you should tell those who teach you I taught at IIM Calcutta, so I'm familiar with the business school world. That's gone missing.
So one exception, NIFT, and I teach that subject, professional practice, ethics and values. In NIFT.
There could be. So there are general courses around ethics and strategy and something like that.
All right,
So
thank
some portion of ethics is being taught, but I don't know how far the students are taking it seriously.
That's for every question.
Since he's in a hurry to close, I just want to say this. Don't blame the students.
Absolutely.
When the teachers practice ethics, they will automatically learn it. If parents tell lies, children cannot be expected to tell the truth.
And better still if we start at the primary level, only then it will work.
Sir, last question.
In the interest of time, we'll have to close the Q&A. Thank you, everyone, for such an engaging Q&A session. May I now request Professor Nayyar to please give the concluding remarks?
In my experience, time and patience are both exhaustible resources. I think we've had a wonderful, engaging session. Thank you all for being here. And I will tell you a story about closing remarks. No offense intended. Once I was on a panel at the IIC auditorium on which there were 5 people. It started at 6:30 in the evening. It was already 8:10 when 4 people had finished speaking. So the person who preceded me, just the penultimate speaker, was Abid Hussain. He was very brief, although Abid loved to talk. And when it came to my turn, I simply said, I recognize that time and patience are both exhaustible resources. Thank you. And I sat down. I got the loudest applause. So I'm not going to tax you anymore with concluding remarks.
All right, may I now request Mr. Krishan Kalra, past president, AIMA, to please present mementos. First to our chief guest, Professor Deepak Nayyar. Big round of applause, please. Thank you. Now to Mr. Gopal.
This is to show adaptation. Ecological flow.
With this, we've come to the end of the session. We would like to thank our dignitaries, Mr. Gopalakrishnan and Professor Deepak Nayyar. Thank you for your time, sir. And the audience, you've been wonderful here. Thank you very much. The books would be outside. Do grab your copy.
Congratulations.
And get it signed. Thank you.
Not talk anywhere.